Hilchos Nedarim Perek Sheni, the laws of vows, chapter 2. Today, the chapter is basically split in two parts. First, we have laws that are related to the formulation of vows, different conditions that have to be present while you make a vow. You have to mean what you say what you mean. We'll talk about vows that can be interpreted in different ways. How do you interpret it? And then the second half of the chapter is concerned with a subject that's called hefker. Hefker means ownerless, and it's the power that a person has to declare his possessions ownerless. The Rambam is going to include these laws in this chapter because in a way, when a person declares that his property is hefker, it's like a vow. You're making a vow essentially saying, I will no longer benefit from my possessions, and therefore anyone else could grab it if they want. And we're going to see the laws that dictate how much time you have to grab, what does it take to grab, can the original owner grab it back? That's going to be where we're headed today. So the Rambam begins, Halacha Aleph. Echad hanoider mipi atzmai, oy shehidirei chaveiroi va'amar amen. When it comes to vows, you can formulate a vow on your own. You can say, these fruit are going to be forbidden to me like we saw yesterday. Or someone else can put you under a vow. And you can respond with amen, and then the vow takes effect on you. Or respond something which has the same meaning as amen, like okay, I accept. In other words, if Philip were to say to me, I put you under a vow that you're never going to eat meat again, and I say amen, by your pronunciation, I become under a vow. Shehu kabbalas dvarim, some kind of acceptance of the words. If I accept what you say, you become under the authority of the vow. Halacha beis ve'ein hanoider nesar bedavar she'asar al atzmai. A person making a vow can only prohibit himself in whatever he prohibits. Ad sheyoitzi bisvasav. He needs to first verbally express it. No such things as vows in your mind. You can't just think, I don't want to, eat any more fruit or any more figs. You got to say it, and not only do you have to say it, v'yepiv v'liboy shavin. Another important rule. Your mouth and your heart need to be equal. You got to mean what you say and say what you mean. We're going to soon see how this can have a major ramification. These are the laws by vows, the same way as we explained it by oaths. But for example, let's say your heart and your mind and your mouth weren't aligned. You meant to make a Nazir vow. You wanted to become a Nazirite. And instead, what comes out of your mouth is, I'm going to bring a sacrifice. Bekarban v'nadar benazir, or the opposite. You meant to express a vow to bring a sacrifice. And then you find yourself saying, I'm going to be a Nazir. Bishvua v'nadar, or you wanted to express something as an oath, and instead you expressed it as a vow. Oisheniskavin lindar v'nishba, or you meant to express that as a vow, and you expressed it as an oath. Oisheniskavin leimar te'enim v'amar anavim, or you meant to say figs, they ended up saying grapes. In all these cases, your mind and your mouth doesn't match, and therefore mutar b'shneim, you're permitted on both objects, but in kan neder, there's no vow at all. However, when do we allow for this heart-mouth permissibility is only if you made your vow on your own. However, hanoider al das acherim, if you declare your vow to be on someone else's mind, in other words, I'm going to make the vow and you're going to dictate the terms, hareze kenishba al das acherim, then it has the same law as someone who takes an oath on someone else's mind, which we said in the laws of oaths, you can't later say, I didn't mean it. Because when you hinge your oath or your vow on what someone else is thinking, they get to interpret it, not you. That's why in the court, whenever a beis din makes somebody swear, before he swears, they always say, you should know, we're not letting you swear on your own terms, you're swearing on our terms. Because then, there's no room for interpretation. Same thing applies if somebody makes a vow, and then within the time it takes to speak, this is a Talmudic amount of time, which is the time it takes to say, Shalom Alecha Rabbi, peace unto you, my master. It's about, let's call it 2 seconds. Within 2 seconds, you retract, or somebody listening to you protested your vow within 2 seconds, and you accepted their protest. Like let's say you said, you know what, I make a vow, meat is going to be forbidden to me for the next 30 days. And you hear me, you're like, well, 1 second. And next week you're going to the wedding, you have to eat at the wedding. So you protested against my vow within 2 seconds. And I said, oh yeah, you're right, good point. Hareza mutar. then the vow is absolved, and you're now permitted to eat whatever you promised not to eat. V'din kol elu advarim b'nedarim k'dinon b'shvuos. It's the same laws that guide it by oaths, guide it by vows. These are the same exact things. Halacha dalet, a very interesting case, which lends itself to a couple of interpretations in the Rambam's commentaries. We're going to go with just the more straightforward interpretation. Says the Rambam, Mi shehisna kaidem sheyidor ve'amar. A person makes a stipulation before he makes a vow, and he says, Kol neder she'eder mikan va'ad eser shanim. Any vow that I'm going to declare from today for the next 10 years, hareini chayzer bahen, I retroactively retract on them, I hareihin betelim, where they're going to all be cancelled, v'chayetze b'dvarim elu, or anything like it. In other words, in advance you say, whatever I'm going to say in the next 10 years means nothing. By the way, every single Jew does this on Yom Kippur. The opening of Yom Kippur, what do we say? Kol nidrei ve'esarei. Any vows that we're going to make from this Yom Kippur till next Yom Kippur, they're going to be invalid. That's really what we do. This is the halacha we're discussing here. So the Rambam says, you made this stipulation, and then 2 months later, v'achar kach nodar, then you made a vow. So, does it get overruled by the condition that you made earlier or not? So the Rambam says, and it's a little counterintuitive, but here's what the Rambam says. Im haya zoicher hatnai b'shah shenodar. If you remembered the condition that you made in the moment of your vow, then you actually intend to override your condition. Harei nidrei kayam. Your vow is binding. Shaharei bitel hatnai ben eder zeh. Because clearly, since you remembered the condition and you still made the vow, so you overruled it, you canceled it while making the vow. In other words, you've shown that you would rather the vow and not the condition.
You need to be aware and careful.
Exactly. On the other hand, v'im lo yizachar hatanai, ela achar shenadar. If you only remembered the condition after you made the vow, afal pi shekibel hatanai beliboy v'kimoi. Even though when you remembered the condition, you didn't verbally express it. You just reminded yourself of it in your heart and maintained the condition in your heart. Harei haneder batal. Doesn't matter. Now the vow is retroactively annulled. Why? Because you made the stipulation before that any future vows are going to be canceled. You forgot about the stipulation when you made the vow, so clearly you weren't intending to override the stipulation. Now that you remind yourself of your stipulation, it goes into effect, and it retroactively cancels the vow. Even though you don't express it verbally, this retraction with your mouth. By making the stipulation before, you've already prefaced the retraction to the vow, and you've already expressed it with your mouth earlier. You don't have to express it now. So the Rambam's main opinion here is, as is on the top of the chart, Bisha'ah, if you remembered it in the moment, then it's a good vow. If you remembered it afterwards, no matter when afterwards, it's not a good vow. However, says the Rambam, V'yesh shemoira lahachmir. There's an opinion that rules stringently. V'oimer, and he says, when do you get to cancel the vow? After, if you remember the stipulation afterwards, V'hu sheyizkar hatnai. That's only if you remember the condition after making the vow, right after making the vow, within 2 seconds. I'm explaining this halacha to you now as the Keren Oira. It's the most straightforward explanation that I found. If you remember it right afterwards, that's when the stipulation goes into effect. But if you remember it much afterwards, then actually the neder does go into effect. The stipulation is cancelled, and the vow is binding. There's another interpretation of the halacha advanced by the Lechem Mishnah, where he actually says that this opinion is even reversing the original halacha. That even if you remember the stipulation in the moment, then...
In the moment you're saying...
Yes, while you're saying the vow, you remember the stipulation, then the stipulation goes into effect, takes care of the vow, and cancels it, and also if you remembered it right afterwards. But if you remembered it much afterwards, then the stipulation doesn't go into effect, and the neder does go into effect, because you didn't remember the stipulation to cancel it. It's It's kind of like the opposite logic. Halacha hey, misha higdim es hatnai l'shana ila eser. Same scenario. A person prefaces a condition for the next year, for the next 10 years. He says, whatever I do in the next 10 years, cancelled. V'achar kach nodar, and then he makes a vow. V'nizkar b'shah shenodar sheyesh lo itnai. When he made the vow, he remembered that he had some kind of stipulation. V'shachach al eze davar hisna v'chetzad haya hatnai. But he just forgot what exactly was the stipulation, or on which element of the vow was the stipulation. So he knows he has some kind of stipulation, doesn't remember what it is. So now it depends what he said when he made the vow. Im Amar, if he says, Al das rishoyna ani oisa, I know I have some condition in mind. So the vow that I'm making now is on the terms of the original intent that I had when I'm making the stipulation. Ein nidrei neder. So now the vow is not a vow. Shaharei bitle, because in your original stipulation, which you just forgot right now, you actually canceled the vow. And since you said I'm going to do whatever my first original mind was, so the stipulation goes into effect, cancels the vow. But if you didn't say I'm doing it on my original intent, in other words, you're only focusing on your intent right now, your intent right now is to make a vow. Kvar bitel hatnai v'kiyem haneder, or kayam haneder, you've already nullified the stipulation, and therefore the vow is binding. Shaharei zachar b'shas haneder sheyesham tnai v'afal pikein nadar, because you remembered when you made the vow that there was a stipulation, and you still made the vow, which means you intend to override the stipulation and have a really good vow. Says the Rambam Malach Avav, yesh mihad ga'onim sha'imrim, there are some ga'onim, the post-Talmudic era stages, that ruled ein kol elu advarim lehagin ala b'nedarim bilvat. The last two halachot about retraction and future retraction only apply to vows. Loi b'shvuos, not to oaths. V'yesh mi shemayda, but there are others that teach shedina nedarim v'hashvuos b'inyanis elu echad heim. That the law governing vows and oaths in these laws are the exact same thing. It's possible to preface a stipulation to your oaths the same way you do it to your vows. This is actually how we rule. If you look in the Kol Nidre prayer, I thought I had a picture of it, but I don't. In the Kol Nidre prayer, we also mention Shvuos. Kol Nidre ve'esarei u'shvu'ei. That means that we're saying both about vows and about oaths, that we're nullifying them for the future, and therefore whatever vows or oaths we take during the year are retroactively nullified. Halacha Zayin, the Rambam now moves to a new element in the laws of vows. Stam nedarim lahachmir. When a person takes a vow that has some unclarity about it, you have to always be strict. Uperushan, but if he interprets the unclarity, yesh by lahakel lahachmir, he could end up being more lenient or more strict. What does that mean? Ketzad. What does this look like? Ha'omer harei ha'peres ha'elu alai kebasar maliach ukiyayin nesach. A person points at a pile of apples, and he says, these apples, I want to treat them like salty meat and poured wine. Now, salty meat and poured wine could mean two things. We have to ask him, what did you mean when you said salty meat and poured wine? So, im peidash v'amar. If he interprets it and he says, kibasar maliach shel karban, ukiyayin shenisnasech al hamizbeach, haya belibi, I had in mind the salty meat of the sacrifice, the poured wine on the altar. Every day they used to pour wine on the mizbeach. So in other words, he's turning these fruit into a sacrifice. That's a stringency. He wants to forbid the fruit. Hareza usr, so indeed his vow is binding, and he's forbidden to eat the fruit. V'im amar, but if he says, no, loy haya belibi elo tikreves avedas kechavim umazoles, v'yayin shenisnasich lo. I meant salty meat that's brought as a sacrifice to an idol. I meant yayin nesach in the classic sense of the word, wine of libation that's been poured to idol worship. So now, we learned yesterday that you cannot forbid something using something else which is inherently forbidden. Since idol worship is inherently forbidden, the vow doesn't work, hareza mutter, and he's permitted. So here you see there was an unclarity in his vow. He interprets it one way, it becomes strict. He interprets it the other way, it becomes lenient. But if he says, you know what, I didn't mean anything. I just said salty meat, poured wine. I didn't have any specific intent. Hareza usr. We're always going to be stringent, and we're going to say he meant sacrifice, and we're going to forbid the fruit. Halacha ches, another similar scenario. Somebody says, these fruit, I want them to be cherem, consecrated, dedicated. Dedicated to what? There are two types of cherem. We ask him what he meant. If he meant that it should be like things that are dedicated to the temple treasury, asur, then the fruit are forbidden. Because you have the power to make something belong to the temple treasury, so you can compare fruits to that as well, make them forbidden. But if you meant that it should be like things that are dedicated to the priest, to the kohanim, mutter, then it's permitted. The cherem that belongs to the kohanim totally belongs to them. It's totally mundane. It's not prohibited at all, not holy at all. And therefore, you're comparing fruits to permitted things. They're permitted. But if he's unclear, he didn't mean either way specifically. Asur, we're always going to be stringent and say that the fruits are going to be forbidden. Halacha tes, another similar scenario. Harehein olai kemaiser. A person says, I want these fruit to be like maiser. Now maiser, there are two types of maiser. Im kemaiser behema, if he meant the tithing of the animals. Every year a person takes all his animals out of the pen and marks every 10th one. Brings it as a sacrifice. So now you're making a fruit like a sacrifice. That's asur. Now the fruits are forbidden. The vow takes effect. Because it's a sacrifice which you could consecrate by your own hand, as we explained yesterday, and make it forbidden. But if you intend to make it like tithes of produce, tithes that you give to the Levi, mutter, then it's permitted, because the meiser of produce is totally permitted fruit. If you were unclear, you didn't mean this way or that way, we go stringently. Asur, we say it's forbidden. Halacha yud, same thing. Harein olai kitruma. I want the fruits to be like truma. Truma also has two connotations. Imli truma satlishka niskavein. If he meant the half shekel coins that are given as a donation to the temple treasury to bring the sacrifices that we learned in the laws of the half shekel, hareza asur. So you've made your fruit like the half shekel sacrifice related stuff. It's forbidden, therefore. But if you meant truma of the granary, regular truma you give to the kohen, mutter, then it's permitted, because you've made your fruits like permitted stuff. V'im stam, asur, if you were unclear, it's again forbidden. The same thing applies to all similar situations. Whenever we're unclear, we always go stringent. If he interprets it, we go either strict or lenient, whichever one he meant. Says the Rambam. When do we say this? When do we say this swing, that you can go either way? If the place where he made the vow, everyone knows that these words could mean both things. But if it's a place that everybody knows that when you say the word cherem, you only mean the temple treasury type of dedication, and a person in that city says, I want these fruits to be cherem, so we don't ask him for interpretations. Everybody knows in this place that's what cherem means. Hareza asur automatically is forbidden. If it was the opposite, in this place everybody calls cherem the permitted type of dedication, the one that goes to the kohanim. Hareza mutter, so it's all permitted. Anything similar is the same laws. Because there's a cardinal rule which we're going to explore later in chapter 9. When it comes to vows, we only follow huge rule. We always follow the interpretation or the common language of people in that place at that time. The laws fluctuate. There aren't any ironclad rules. You must ask people in California, what does it mean when you say this word? Then that's what you're forbidden in. If you're in New York, maybe it means something else. Slang changes from country to country, continent to continent, from time to time. Take certain English words today that meant things 100 years ago, totally different. In vows, you have to always reckon with the current state of affairs and the local state of affairs. Halacha Yud Beis. What if a person offers an outlandish interpretation to his vow? Hanayder b'cherem. A person promises, he makes a vow that he wants his property to be cherem. Now cherem typically means dedicated to God. We saw before, there could be two types, dedicated to God for the kohanim, dedicated to God for the temple treasury. But in Hebrew, there's another meaning to cherem. Cherem could also mean fishing net. Now that's a very unusual interpretation. The Amar, the guy says afterwards, that's what I meant. I meant this fishing net. I meant to compare my fruits to a fishing net. Okay, there's room. Yeah, cherem does mean that. Or a similar thing, nadar bekarban. A person, you hear a guy say, I want to bring a karban. Now, what does karban mean to you? A sacrifice, okay? It can mean one type of sacrifice, another, but it means a sacrifice. Comes the guy and says, no, I meant a gift to a king. It's also called a karban in Hebrew. Amar lachaveira, a person tells a friend, Hare atzmi alecha karban. I want myself to be a sacrifice to you. That's what atzmi means. Atzmi means usually myself. It means I want you to treat my possessions as a sacrifice. You cannot benefit from it. That's the basic meaning. Comes the guy and says, "V'amar lo haya belibi ela le'asrei ba'etzem shehinachti li liyesh neder b'derech schayk." You know, the word etzem, besides from meaning myself, can also mean bone. So atzmi can also mean my bone. He says, I have a bone that sits in my drawer, and I use that bone to make joking vows. My bone should be forbidden to you, not myself. Okay, it is. It fits in the words, but it's a very outlandish interpretation. Another case. Nadar shalitehana leishtai. He makes a vow, my wife should never have benefit from me. So his wife says, what's going on? The Amar, he says, no, I meant my ex-wife. I meant my first wife who I divorced her. Or any of these scenarios. Everybody listening, any basic person listening would say it means a prohibition. And the guy explains, no, I meant something unusual that makes it permitted. So what do? Bottom line is, he's saying, this is what I meant. So the Rambam says, if the person who made the oath, the vow, is a Torah sage, so we trust him, it's permitted. He doesn't even need to ask a sage to release his vow. But if it's a regular guy, this might lead him to take vows less seriously. We make it appear to him that it's a vow, and that he actually became forbidden to whatever he said. And we find a way, some loophole, to open up an opening and make it permitted. But either way, whether a Torah sage or a regular guy, if someone makes such a vow and then interprets it in this funny way, we scream at them. And we teach them, don't behave this way with vows. It's no good to make these types of joking, jesting vows. So too, someone tells his wife, you will be like my mother. Same way it's forbidden to have relations with my mother, I'm not going to have relations with you. A person says that these fruit should be like pork meat. Whereas we explained yesterday, in these cases, since you're comparing something permitted to something inherently forbidden, the vow doesn't take effect, as we explained yesterday. Nevertheless, if the person making the vow was a Torah sage, he doesn't require it to be released by a sage. But if he's a regular guy, we make him treat it as if it's a regular oath. Go to a sage, get it annulled. And we give him the impression that his wife is forbidden to him, the fruits are forbidden to him. And we find a way to open up a loophole from somewhere else, permit the vow. All this to avoid people treating vows flippantly as a joke. So even though it's halachically not a vow, we make it look like a vow, so we'll take it seriously in the future. Halacha Yudalid, now we move on to the second topic in the chapter, from here till the end, for the next few halachot, hefker. Ha-hefker, says the Rambam, when you declare something ownerless, afal pisha einay neder, even though it's not an actual vow, harehu kemoy neder, it's like a vow, she'asur le'lachzer, where you cannot retract from it. Umau, hefker, what does it mean, hefker? Hu sheyemar adam, it's when a person says, nechasim elu hefker lakol, these properties that I own are ownerless for everybody. Bein b'metaltalin, bein b'karkois, whether it's movable objects, real estate, b'ketzad din hefker, what is the law of something declared ownerless? Whoever comes first and grabs it, does some kind of formal acquisition, he acquires it for himself, it becomes his. There's going to be a whole section of laws on this in the Rambam's 12th book called Hilchos Zechia, how to acquire something from an ownerless state. But let's say you fulfilled the condition, you did it right, it becomes yours. Even the original owner, the person who declared the objects ownerless, his law for the ownerless object is like anybody else. If he goes ahead and grabs it first, he has acquired it. If a person says, you know what, my house is ownerless only for poor guys. Only if you have an income bracket under $20,000, it's ownerless for you. But for rich people, it's not hefker. Einay hefker, it doesn't work. That's not called ownerless. Ad sheyafker lakoil kashmita. Until you make it hefker, ownerless for everybody, like shmita. Shmita is the 7th sabbatical year. All people's fruits become ownerless, and it's equal to everyone. Anyone can go into your field, take the fruits. So when you declare something ownerless, it's be the same way. No parameters, everyone is available. If a person declares his own slaves ownerless, if they're adults, kanu atzman, they acquire themselves, they go free. If they're minors, they're treated like property. Whoever comes and grabs them first gets them. Like any other movable property. If somebody declares real estate ownerless, anybody who grabs it first acquires it. Din Torah, by biblical law, afilu hifker b'fnei echad, that is a hefker, even if you declare something ownerless in front of one person, it's ownerless. V'niftar min ha'maisres kameshi yisbar b'mekayimos. So much so that it becomes exempt from maaser. Only if you own a farm do you have to separate tithes to the Kohen, to the Levi. If a field is ownerless, any fruit growing there doesn't have to have separate maestros or trumas. So if you declare something ownerless, by biblical law, even in front of one person, it's totally hefker, and there's now exemption from the tithes. But rabbinically, nothing is ownerless till you do it in front of three people. Why three? So we have at least one guy who can go grab it, and two witnesses to tell that that's what he did. If somebody says, this is ownerless, and this. So what does it mean, and this? The second object is a doubt whether it's ownerless or not. But if he says, this is hefker, and this should be like this, so you've clearly linked the two, or you said, and also this, you've certainly attached the second object, and it is for sure hefker ownerless. A person declared his field ownerless, but nobody came to get it. For the first 3 days, he can retract. After 3 days, you cannot retract, it's fully ownerless, unless you come and actively do some kind of acquisition that's binding halachically, then you'll be like acquiring it from ownerlessness, whether you or somebody else. If somebody says, I want this field to be ownerless only for 1 day. L'Shabbos achas for 1 week, l'Chodesh echad for 1 month, l'Shana achas for 1 year, l'Shavua echad for 1 7-year cycle. So long as nobody acquired it, you or someone else, but you can retract. But once somebody else grabs it, whether you or someone else, but you cannot retract. How come over here we don't say the 3-day limitation? You can always go back till someone grabs it. It's a very unusual case. Nobody declares things ownerless for a set time. 1 day, 1 week, 1 month. And therefore, you always have the power to go back. Halacha Yutes, that Rambam concludes. Davar hamufkar. If something was declared ownerless, sheba echad ushmarei, and someone came and watched it, and he's watching it, so nobody should take it. Just watching it doesn't make it yours. You must either pick it up if it was movable property, or do some kind of manual act on real estate to show that it's yours, like a regular buyer will acquire land. Kids say, I saw it first. Nuh-uh. Saw it first doesn't matter. It's who gets it first that matters.